Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome for a second time a well-known and respected expert on Asia, India, and China from Perth, Australia, Mr. Rajat Ganguly. Rajat, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ashutosh. Thanks for inviting me back
Thank
again.
you. Thank you. Rajat is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Asian Security and International Affairs. He's an author of several books and published papers. His latest paper is titled Internal Security Challenges in India, which was published on the 16th of June 25. And we are going to be speaking today about these internal security challenges that he has researched and reviewed. Rajat, before we start, I want to ask you, would you like to say anything about the paper, and then we can get straight into the questions?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me back to your show again. And it's a real honor and a privilege to be with you. The paper came about as a result of a series of conversations with Professor Salvatore Babones, who's the director of the India's Century Roundtable. And I think it's an area of work which probably is a little bit neglected in mainstream international politics or even Indian politics. Systematic study of threats that emerge from within the borders of a state.
Mm.
And if you actually, if I want to give it a little bit of an intellectual cover, then in international security studies, in the traditional way that we understood security, it has always revolved around the question of safeguarding the state from external enemies.
Mm.
And internal security mattered to international security experts to the extent that they magnified the external danger.
Mm.
So, basic idea is if your house is divided, then your enemies outside the country may find that to be an opportune moment to attack you.
Mm.
But not much serious attention probably was given to how a state could be undermined from within. There was this basic assumption that if you have a strong state which can defend itself from external forces,
Mm-hmm.
then automatically that defends the state and its society and its people from external danger. So the focus has always been on the external part of the threat.
Right.
Whereas our understanding is that there are many countries which probably they may face external problems, external danger, and India certainly is one. But on the other hand, that there are probably also equally problematic internal challenges that needs to be dealt with in a firm way, in a very prudent, nuanced way, so that once you are internally stable, then you are better able to meet your external dangers.
Right.
So the paper came about as a result of these conversations with Salvatore, and he asked me, what would you consider to be, some of the key internal problems that India is facing. So that's how the thinking started.
Amazing. And I know Salvatore very well. In fact, I've spoken to him twice on my show, and I'm speaking to him again tomorrow about his new book. So
yes, Dharma Democracy, which is going to be a real challenge for a lot of people covering Indian politics.
Absolutely. In fact, maybe at some stage in the next month or so, we'll do a conversation between you, him, and me on what's happening on India and a whole lot of others. But that's for another date.
Sure.
Rajat, you outlined 6 major internal security challenges in India today. How did you, before I come to each of these, how did you prioritize these over other concerns like cyber threats or organized crime?
Yeah. Look, I mean, for me, I think the real question has always been, what keeps India together, given this massive diversity of India. India is a big country. It's a massive country. And not only massive geographically, but then it's also mind-bogglingly complex. If I use the word ethnic in the broadest sense of the term, so mind-bogglingly complex in an ethnic, identity sort of way. if you travel across India, as you have done so many times, I have done, language changes within a few hundred kilometers, food changes, the music changes, dress, etc. I mean, to be honest, I mean, I think the unique part of India is its diversity.
Right.
Diversity of language, diversity of identity, diversity of culture, etc., etc. So for me, studying political science, studying India, looking at India from both inside and then leaving India and looking at India from the outside, the real question intellectually that has always interested me is, what keeps India together? And when you study Indian freedom movement, when you study how independence came, etc., etc., there was this line of thinking among some individuals, and not necessarily only Indians, but even outside India, that it was only a matter of time before India balkanized, and India would break into many smaller countries. It won't be able to stay together. And this kind of thinking was revived again in the early 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed. That, I mean, I still remember, I mean, I was in graduate school at the time. One of my professors asked me this question, that now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, do you think, it's a matter of time before the Indian empire collapsed? So they looked at India as an empire.
Correct.
But India has kicked on. We celebrated 75 years. We are heading towards 2047, the centenary year of our independence. And I think it's incredibly exciting to hear conversations about, what are we going to look like in 2047? Are we going to be a developed country with modern infrastructure and so on? So I think the first question to answer, come back to your question, and what interested me is, what I would consider the main challenge for India is to manage its ethnic diversity.
Well said.
Manage this massive country, to keep it together, keep it intact, keep it going. And our framers were, framers of the Constitution were aware of this challenge. So they put in the Constitution many different things to try and address this. And I think no government in India can ever take its eyes off this, saying, that now that we have crossed 75 means we'll always be there. We have to be vigilant. We have to always maintain this unity.
Absolutely.
So that's how it started. I mean, that's how.
Very well said. And your response gives me a segue to the first thread that you talk about, which is ethnic mobilization and state reorganization.
Yeah.
What were, in your view, the unintended consequences of the ethno-linguistic reorganization of states in the 1950s and beyond?
It's a very serious question, in the sense that when we inherited the country from the British in 1947, we didn't have ethno-linguistic provinces, and so on. So we had administrative provinces, which, for good or bad, it was decided that no, this is not the way we want to reorganize our governance internally. We want to get rid of these administrative big provinces and instead replace it with some notion of this ethno-linguistic criteria applied in a very broad way. It is not by any means a precise science, but there was this understanding that India comprised several ethno-linguistic groups, and if we empower these groups, if we create boundaries of these groups, then they can become part of what eventually emerged as a federal polity. So I think the discussion of federalism, where power is divided between a central government and provinces. So the question really was, how do you organize the provinces? And the decision was that we're going to do this in a ethno-linguistic way. But then when you use the ethno-linguistic criteria, what you find is that this is going to take you eventually towards greater and greater number of units. So today we have 28 states divided, India divided roughly into these 28 ethno-linguistic identities. But there are so many sub-identities within these states
Mm.
that are waiting in the wings to, in a sense. So some of my previous work on the agitation in North Bengal, for example, in the hills of Darjeeling, etc., where they were agitating to create a separate Gorkhaland state.
Yeah.
So that's one example. It's not finished yet. Obviously, these sort of agitations go up and down a while.
Mm.
So that's definitely there. If you look at the Indian Northeast, Assam was broken up,
Yeah.
and the Seven Sisters were created.
Mm.
But did that solve the ethnic question? No, because the internal boundaries of these states often is an issue, particularly between Assam and Nagaland, Assam and Manipur. But then there are also groups that feel that they are entitled to separate statehood, like the Boros of Assam, that we should have a Boro land. If you look at mainstream India, there has always been a strong demand for a Purbanchal state by dividing the eastern part of UP, creating Purbanchal. Then, of course, Jammu had a long-standing demand for a separate statehood identity. You also had the Nagpur area of Maharashtra, the eastern part of Maharashtra, the Vidarbha part. On and off again demands that Vidarbha should be separate from Maharashtra. Why should we be governed from Bombay and not from Nagpur? That sort of a question. So my sense is that when you walk that ethno-linguistic line, it's very hard to then stop.
Correct.
and say that, look, we have got 28 and we are not going to become a country of 50 provinces, like the US, for example, or more, for that matter. And at some point, somebody would have to draw the line, because taken to a very logical extreme, this would become nonsensical.
Correct. Correct.
So while I understand why this was done, because this was done to sort of address the question of who constitutes India, what are the main groups. It was a form of empowerment, recognition of their identity, of their language, etc. But it also created probably a sense of entrapped minority sentiment. So if you go and ask the Gorkhas of Darjeeling or the Rajvanshis of Kuch Bihar, they would say that the Bengalis are not the best representatives of our problems, our demands. There has always been this idea that Calcutta has neglected the hills because the hills don't have enough population to generate enough votes.
Correct.
So it all comes down to then again to electoral politics.
Correct.
That if we have electorally, if we are very small, then our voice will be ignored. So
Very
therefore. And some scholars would also argue, Ashutosh, that actually going up to maybe 40 states or 50 states is not a bad idea, for the simple matter that it brings power closer to the population.
Correct.
So, if you are talking about democratic accountability, it's not a bad idea to have power very close to the people. And if you have a separate Gorkhaland and then situation in Darjeeling doesn't improve, you don't have to blame Calcutta for it anymore.
Correct.
You can blame your Gorkha leaders for that,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Or Kuch Bihar or Bodoland or whatever it is. But then on the other hand, you also have massive administrative cost.
Correct.
Instead of 28 chief ministers, you have to maintain 50 chief ministers, 50 different state administrations, etc., etc. So it's a trade-off.
Absolutely.
Do we walk that
But
path?
there's another aspect that I wanted to get your perspective on, which is on the linguistic aspect. And while there were advantages and its own disadvantages, the fact that today language is becoming a major political tool for regional parties for whipping up sentiment. Do you think it's dysfunctional now?
Well, look, I mean, language can always be misused for political ends, right? I mean, in the 1960s, there was this bogey of Hindi imposition on everybody. The South, the DMK politics was based on that. That we are Tamil nationalists and we are not
Correct.
going to allow Hindi to be imposed.
Hmm.
And some within the DMK in those days were willing to talk also about possible secession from India, that if required, South would be a separate country altogether.
Hmm.
Some of that language is coming back, by the way.
Yeah.
If you have noticed in recent times, some of that language,
That's
the
what I'm
bogey of
referring
that.
to now. Yes.
Yeah, I know. And some of that bogey is being brought back.
Yeah.
Not in a serious way to challenge the unity of India, perhaps,
Hmm.
but to further political interest or political forces.
Correct.
In Maharashtra, this is happening.
Maharashtra,
So
Tamil Nadu,
yeah,
West Bengal.
West Bengal, all of a sudden now in West Bengal, there is this bogey movement that Bengalis are under threat in
Yeah.
rest of India,
Hmm.
and Bengali language is under threat.
Hmm.
And whether you could equate the Bengali language with illegal Bangladeshis
Yeah.
and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden a movement is being created, right?
Absolutely.
An agenda is being created.
Hmm.
So this can be misused. But the bigger problem is when you say there are going to be 28 states, then basically, you're saying, oh, these are major languages. So major ethnic identity, major languages. So ethno-linguistic. Our constitution recognizes 18 national languages. Then you have Hindi, then you have English, linked language. And we have over 700 dialects in India, languages, dialects, etc. So how far down the line do you go? Do you then say, well, Gorkha speak a Gorkhali language, or Eastern UP speaks a Eastern UP language, or Vidarbha speaks a Vidarbha language? I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that while you may think in one sense that this is empowering people and empowering identity and giving recognition to language, on the other hand, my worry is that the more internal lines that we draw, the more divisive the country becomes in a sense. So the points of fracture, if you ever have a fracture, will be so many that it will almost become impossible to control it. So India, and this is very personal. I mean, my sense is that at some point we have to focus on what unites India.
Correct.
Our common identity. The identity of being an Indian or a Bharatiya.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Let me now move to the second challenge which you have outlined, which is Jammu and Kashmir and the Islamist radicalization and jihadist networks. And my first question is, how significant was Article 370 in either exacerbating or mitigating the insurgency in J&K?
It was tremendously important, because what happened was, when in 47, I mean, if you look at the accession of Kashmir to India, this accession happened under very stressful circumstances in 1947. So around October of 1947, right? Initially, there was this tribal invasion launched from Pakistan, and then India then airlifted forces after the Maharaja acceded, etc. This is in 47. So Indian Constitution had not come into being at that time.
Correct.
Indian Constitution came into being in 1950.
Yeah.
So there was a temporary provision always in the Constitution under Article 370, empowering the government of India that this is a special area that you are incorporating into India. You incorporate it under temporary circumstances, given what's happening on the ground in 47, 48, then the ceasefire in 1949, etc. And once the dust settles, then this will be looked at, right? So the understanding was that this is temporary.
Yeah.
This is not a permanent lines of merger with India. Correct. The merger itself was not questioned, but the terms of the merger were deliberately kept open so that once the situation stabilizes, once the Constitution comes into being in 1950, the government can then take measures to get rid of this and say, this incorporation is now final. These are the terms under which this has been done. Now, no government did that. It was a temporary provision left until 2019, and not for any other reason but politics. This was all driven by politics.
Yeah.
And government added Article 35A to that, which was the other very draconian thing, that only Kashmiris can own anything in Kashmir. And even Kashmiri women, if they get married to person who's from outside Kashmir and they settle outside Kashmir, they can't inherit anything in Kashmir, things of those kinds. So instead of trying to integrate Kashmir with India, my argument would be that it actually helped to create always this separatist notion that we are somehow different from India. And I've been to Kashmir 3-4 times, and every time I have been there, every time I've spoken to the local people, I've got this very distinct feeling that they, again, I'm generalizing, but they see us coming from outside Kashmir to Kashmir, essentially almost like foreign tourists coming to Kashmir. And, we are the locals, this is ours, and you guys are from outside.
Yeah.
And if you tell them that, well, actually, you are part of India, you carry an Indian passport, you get all the benefits of being an Indian citizen, you can go and, buy property in the rest of India, you can do business in the rest of India, your kids are studying in universities scattered all over India. So while you are benefiting from India, you do not want, non-Kashmiris to come and benefit from the local economy, the local, the local situation, etc. You want to keep it as totally separate.
Yeah.
So looking at it dispassionately, I would say this was one of the biggest reasons why this separate identity was maintained. Now, it's a question of political wisdom, judgment, why this was done, why nobody wanted to challenge this. Was this the best way to handle Kashmir? And opinion will differ. Some people will say, no, this was not the best way to handle Kashmir. Some people would say this actually played into the hands of the local Kashmiri politicians, the political parties. Every time they didn't get whatever they wanted from the Indian state, they raised the bogey of separatism. They talked about, that the merger was done under suspicious circumstances, etc., etc. So all of that problem you could have dealt with if you had been very decisive right in the beginning after 1950 to say temporary provision is gone. We are now incorporating Kashmir into India. Kashmir is just like any other state of India. And all the laws of India will prevail in Kashmir, etc., etc. But you didn't do that. In Kashmir's case also, as you know, the problem was compounded by the fact that we made the blunder of making it international.
Correct.
We took it to the UN when we didn't have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the, our neighboring country, Pakistan, going through so much instability, do you see its role in Kashmir declining or becoming more dangerous?
That's a very complicated question, and the answer, there's no simple answer to that. And you have to look at, what has happened in Pakistan since 1947. Pakistan was created on the basis of the two-nation theory, which basically said that Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus are two separate nations. They cannot coexist, blah, blah. But then partition didn't really address that question, right? So if you read the works of B.R. Ambedkar, Ambedkar was very critical of partition. He said, look, the partition only would make sense if there was a total exchange of population. If Pakistan were to have all the Muslims of the subcontinent and India then has Hindus and others, under those circumstances can partition make sense. But you can't do that because unmixing population is not that easy. So when you couldn't do that, why have a partition? Because then when you partitioned and India ended up with more Muslims than Pakistan, that was, that sounded the death knell of the two-nation theory. And Pakistan's problem has been this, that the ideology on which it was founded was found to be so hollow. And then Islam also didn't become the glue that many in Pakistan thought it might be. Separation of East Pakistan is a case in point. So Pakistan's political problems, ideological, constitutional, then the military emerging as the guardian force in Pakistan, because they realized that without our intervention, the state will collapse. The ethnic divisions on the ground, even in West Pakistan until 71, were vicious. I mean, Balochistan didn't want to be part of Pakistan. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, these are stolen Afghan lands,
Yeah.
stolen by the British Indian government through the 3 Anglo-Afghan wars. No Afghan government has ever recognized the Durand Line as the permanent border between
Right.
Afghanistan and
Yes.
Pakistan, right? So state integrity, ethnic boundaries, political and ideological problems, the military's emergence, the empowerment of the Punjabis, all of this is very, very crucial to understand what Pakistan, eventually has become.
Yeah.
I would say one other thing, which is that until the advent of Zia in the 1970s, most of Pakistan's military leaders or dictators were hardcore realists. They were strategic, they were realists,
Yeah.
they were certainly not ideologues.
Hmm.
Zia probably is the first military general of Pakistan, the leader of Pakistan, who was a confirmed Islamist. He was
Right.
an Islamist ideologue, right? And he therefore found fertile ground with the anti-Soviet jihad in the 1980s, which the Americans pushed, financed by America, financed by Saudi Arabia. And Pakistan became the staging ground of this Mujahideen jihad against Soviet occupying forces in Afghanistan. And then after Zia died in the late 80s, and then the Afghan jihad came to an end with the withdrawal of the Soviet forces, Kashmir then erupted. So it was very easy for the Pakistani operators to transfer the jihad from the western flank in Afghanistan to the eastern part in Kashmir. So what you saw in Kashmir, I mean, if you look at the timeline, starts with the student protest in 87, which was basically a protest against the rigging of the 87 state elections. Turns into a full-blown call for insurgency by 1989. And this insurgency initially was led by groups like the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, JKLF.
Yeah.
These guys were talking about independence from both India and Pakistan, right? And this was going back to the pre-47 era, where you could argue that there was some opinion in Kashmir that if J&K did not join either India or Pakistan, it could emerge as an independent country, which, by the way, was not a choice given in the transfer of power documents. So, what Mountbatten had told the princes was that you have no choice. You have to either join India or Pakistan, keeping in mind your geography and wishes of the population. So independence was not theoretically an option, but some people thought that might be possible. But then to Pakistan, this option of independence of Jammu and Kashmir is completely unacceptable because, ideologically, it still does not make sense because, if you're based on the two-nation theory and a Muslim majority region doesn't come to you, then what does it say about the strength of your ideology, right? So merger of Jammu and Kashmir or annexation of Jammu and Kashmir is a absolute vital plank of Pakistani policy. So what these guys did was they sidelined the JKLF, these people, and they infiltrated the hardcore Islamist agenda into the valley, which led to the atrocities against the Pandits, all the rapes, the murders, the expulsion of the population. So the fact that the small Hindu population in the valley were systematically terrorized and cleansed from the valley, so they're still living in the outskirts of Delhi, right? You can see them, in refugee camps.
Absolutely.
And no Indian government, Congress, UPA, BJP, etc., have lifted a finger to help these people. So this set into motion this Islamist agenda in the valley in the 1990s. And look, I mean, a lot of people say that local Kashmiri people have moved away from that. They are not like that. There's a syncretist culture in Kashmir and so on and so forth. But actually, on the ground, people, if you go there, I mean, people would have a slightly different, experience even today. And it would have to be, Kashmir would have to be integrated a lot more into India, and development will have to happen uninterrupted for a while, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, maybe 1-2 generations have to be born.
Correct.
Before some of those ideas can be erased the general
Well said.
population.
Well said. One more question relating to Jammu and Kashmir and Pakistan and Islam. I mean, we've got our own terrorist organizations or Islamist organizations like SIMI and PFI, both of them are banned. But
Yeah.
given their presence in our country, could the idea of Ghazwa-e-Hind ever find traction beyond fringe circles? And I often hear this on Pakistan television.
Well, if you go and actually look at the website of the Pakistani army, the Pakistani Army's website says there are 3 core mottos or mission of the Pakistani Army. One is Iman, Taqwa, and Jihad fi Sabilillah. So, by their own definition, this is an army not of a nation state, but of Islam.
Correct.
They are waging jihad. So, when they go into battle, they are going into jihad. Now, the question then becomes, what is this jihad for? So you're waging jihad. So purpose of the jihad is what? The
Correct.
purpose of the jihad is to reconquer the Indian subcontinent. So battle for the subcontinent is what Ghazwa-e-Hind is, right? Ghazwa means war. Hind is Hindustan. So we are in a war for Hindustan to re-establish Islamic rule in Hindustan. Now, why is this important in a more philosophical way? Because in Islam, there are these 2 binary conditions in which Muslims generally would find themselves. One is called, the Darul Islam, which means that this is land which is ruled by Islam's forces. And then there is the Darul Harb.
Correct.
That should be Islam. Islam should be the ruler, but Islam is not. So this is ruled by non-Muslims, non-Islamic people. You can call them kafirs, you can call them whatever you want, but they are the ones in power. That's not acceptable, so we need to change that and convert a Darul Harb into a Darul Islam, right?
Correct.
So purpose of Ghazwa-e-Hind is basically this, that Hindustan since 1947 has been ruled by non-Muslims. And therefore, we are in a state of war. And in a state of war in a very broad sense of the term. This is not just kinetic war. There's a non-kinetic war as well. And it is to re-establish Islamic rule in India, in the subcontinent. And from time to time, you will hear Maulanas in Pakistan or in Bangladesh or even some in India often giving voice to that goal, saying this is what we want, right? Now, the other justification of this is apparently people say that this was something that is mentioned in the Hadith. Prophet Muhammad had talked about this, that Islamic forces will eventually take control of Indian subcontinent on one side and Europe on the other side. So Erdogan, he talks about Islam coming to reconquer Europe. So this is not Ghazwa-e-Hind. This is probably Ghazwa-e-Europe.
Right.
That we are coming to reconquer Europe, re-establish the Ottoman Muslim rule over Europe, and we will do it either with kinetic means, with force in some senses, but for the most part, probably non-kinetic means as well. So this mass migration into Europe is probably a part of that Ghazwa-e-Europe.
Absolutely.
Whereas in India's case, it is Ghazwa-e-Hind. In multiple ways, forces are fighting to re-establish, to convert India into a Darul Islam. One thing I would also add to this is, and this is something that a lot of Indian kids studying in school probably wouldn't know this because this is not taught in a very organized way. But when the initial discussion that the British are going to leave India, when that started in the 1920s, moving into the 30s and so on, there was a segment of Muslim opinion in India which argued that since the British took power in India from Muslim rulers, the last Mughal emperor was Bahadur Shah Zafar, who had to sign this document with the company, East India Company, and he was sent into exile in Metia Buruz in Calcutta. So British basically took over from the Mughals, from the Nawabs in Lucknow and so on and so forth. So Muslim rule was there and we lost power at the hands of the British. So this argument was that now that the British have decided that after almost 200 years of rule that they're going to go back, we must return the power back to Muslim rulers,
Mm.
because we were the people who were in power. So if you
Yeah.
take power from me, and now that you want to go away,
Correct.
give the
You
power
got to
back to
give
me.
back to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the British said, no, that's not possible. That's
Mm.
impossible. So,
Mm.
we will have to give it back to the majority, etc.,
Absolutely.
etc.
Yeah.
And that's when I think the thinking started that, okay, if power is going to go into the hands of non-Muslims, then let's divide the country, create a Muslim state. But then that Muslim state doesn't solve anything. So, eventually after 47, everywhere you look, there are this mentality,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
sentiment for Ghazwa-e Hind,
Correct.
which is now taking more concrete shape, I might say.
Mm.
So
Absolutely.
this is a big internal security challenge
Yeah.
for India to deal with.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Rajat, let's now move to the third challenge, which you outline as Punjab and the Khalistan movement. And while it was at its peak in the 80s, and I remember that very distinctly,
Yeah.
with Operation Blue Star, etc., I thought it
Right.
had started to dissipate, but I now suddenly see it rearing its head in Australia, in Canada, and the US. How real is the threat of a renewed Khalistan insurgency within India today?
Probably not as a major immediate concern.
Hmm.
And if you actually, you refer to the anti-insurgency or counter-insurgency operations in
Yeah,
the Punjab.
yeah.
So the way that Khalistan insurgency was finished was, the state took no prisoners.
Mm.
So a lot of people who were in the movement were eliminated.
Yeah.
Infamous
Bhimrao Wale.
operations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, KPS Gill and the
Yeah.
Indian Army
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
on.
Mm.
KPS Gill was infamous in Punjab.
I know. I
You
know.
may remember, actually, fellow Bengali Siddhartha Shankar Roy was
Absolutely.
appointed governor of Punjab to
Yes.
basically do what he had done to the Naxals in Bengal,
Correct.
against the Khalistanis.
Mm.
So a big chunk was eliminated, but a big chunk then escaped from India, and
Mm.
through various routes they ended up in Canada, in the US, in
Yeah.
Australia, and so on.
Mm.
So I think the Khalistan movement is now, pretty much a movement outside India,
Mm.
where these people are constantly harassing, creating a ruckus, etc., trying to give India a bad name.
Mm.
Most Sikhs that I know,
Mm.
and most people of Punjab that I know,
Mm.
absolutely hate the concept of Khalistan.
I agree.
They have always been with India.
Yeah.
So there's no issue there. But I think what came out for me, a bit of a concern was, you may remember that a couple of years ago, Modi's convoy was suddenly stopped on a
Mm.
overpass in Punjab. He had gone to
Yes.
Punjab to do a speech,
Yes. Yes.
and Modi could have been assassinated
Correct.
that day,
Mm.
because he was very vulnerable. He was a stationary target on a flyover,
Yeah.
and vehicles backed up, and this was done perhaps with the connivance, I don't know, of the local government, local administration.
Mm.
And I don't know what happened really after that. Did heads roll? Did police head get fired? What did the Punjab government have to say? But I think Modi had a close shave that day.
Correct.
So my view is that, given that this so-called farmers' protest happened mostly from Punjab and Haryana, etc., and this was infiltrated with Naxalite elements, the hardcore left elements, and so on.
Mm.
So there is probably now in Punjab a criminal nexus being formed of Naxalites, maybe some remnant Khalistanis, a lot of criminal gangs, particularly those who peddle drugs and so on, because Punjab is the drug capital of India.
Yeah.
So there's an unholy nexus probably is happening inside Punjab.
Mm.
The internal security situation in Punjab probably is not good from that point of view.
Mm.
And these people could do almost anything, a terror strike. And I think even the idea that they could harm the Prime Minister of India was not probably too far-fetched. So I don't think it's an organized armed insurgency to separate Punjab. But on the other hand, if you think of internal problems in the form of committing crimes, etc., terrorism, etc., I don't think the signs are very positive.
Well said. Let's now move to the fourth one, which is insurgencies in the Northeast. Uh, this government has spent a lot of time, effort, and money in bridging or building bridges with the Seven Sisters in the Northeast.
Correct.
I'd love to get your perspective on why has the Northeast remained so resistant to full political integration with the Indian Union?
I'll tell you a little story,
Hmm.
Ashutosh. Several years ago, when I first started looking into the Indian Northeast, I had a conversation with a fairly high up government official in Delhi who was looking after the Northeast and who had knowledge over the Northeast. And that's the first time I learned about the bus analogy. And the bus analogy is that, a bus keeps traveling on the road. So people get in after a little while, some people get off, some new passengers get in, but the bus keeps rolling, right?
Yeah.
So insurgency in the Northeast was explained to me through that analogy of the bus, that the insurgencies will keep rolling. New players will come in, will make deals with some players will stop, but some new actors would come in. So we have to deal with that. So I asked him about conflict resolution, being a little green behind my ears in those days, I used to believe that conflicts can actually be resolved if done the right way. So he said, well, we don't talk about resolution. We talk about managing a conflict. So the state's way of looking at it is that if, there's a problem going on and I'm getting, 5 people killed in a month, I can possibly deal with that. I can live with that. Five is not a big number. But if suddenly 50 people are dying a month, then that's a problem. Then I have to, come hard at the insurgency and push these people into the jungles. I have to buy some peace. And buying peace, creating that sense of stability. It might be a very illusionary stability, but creating that sense of stability can be done by using kinetic forces, kinetic means, or even non-kinetic means, that you give bribes to these so-called insurgents. You buy their silence, or you buy their non-action by giving them money.
Yeah.
And this usually used to happen before state elections, that the existing power doesn't want any problems, because this would obviously affect people who are going to go and vote. So they would pay the insurgents a huge amount of money, for the next 6 months, don't create any trouble for us. And let the election get over. And after the election, we will come back and address some of your questions.
Yeah.
So some of this happened. Now, there's a deeper structural reason why insurgencies happen in the Northeast. Part of it is the lack of integration of the Northeast. It has always been treated as a periphery of India. And I think Prime Minister Modi has understood that. Amit Shah has understood that we cannot treat the Northeast as a periphery. We have to, integrate it much more tightly.
Absolutely. Yes.
It is also the question of integration is also problematic in a political sense, because Northeast has very few people. So in terms of total population of the Northeast as a percentage of the Indian population, it's in single digits.
Yeah.
So again, the electoral clout thing comes in. So when you have small population, who's listening to them really? So lack of opportunity, lack of integration, etc. Plus being on the international border, and a border that is incredibly volatile.
Yes.
Myanmar border is an incredibly volatile border.
Correct.
So is the Bangladesh border. And if you look at Arunachal Pradesh's northern border with China, that's also a very volatile border, right? So when you are in an area where you have these international boundaries, which are very hard to sort of border in a hard sense, you're going to get these outsiders coming in and influencing what's happening inside you. So Chinese arms coming in, local ethnic groups in Myanmar who have affinity with some of the locals on this side, they are coming in, going. Massive quantity of drugs coming in. So a lot of these insurgents are heavily into the drug, network. They finance their livelihoods, their operations through drug money. It's a very complicated chessboard.
Yeah.
And then internally also there are these questions about where the state boundaries lie. So if you look at the Nagaland issue, for example, one of the core demands of the Nagas has been the question of a greater Nagaland.
Correct.
So they are not satisfied with the borders of Nagaland as
Yeah.
it exists.
Mm.
So they believe that some districts of Assam should be detached and made part of Nagaland.
Mm.
Some parts of Meghalaya should become part of Nagaland, etc., etc. So some of that rhetoric is coming through. Some of that
Mm.
narrative is coming
Yeah.
through. So it's a difficult area to control in terms of the border,
Mm.
in terms of what's coming in.
Mm.
And you know that the Indian government has been talking about fencing the India-Myanmar border.
Mm.
But can you fence the entirety of the Indian-Myanmar border? Can you
Definitely.
fence the
Yeah.
entirety of the India-Bangladesh border?
Yeah. Yeah.
And especially now with what's going on in Bangladesh.
Mm. Mm.
So whether you like it or not, you've got to have very heavy security presence in the Indian
Mm.
Northeast.
Mm.
I think India is also very aware of the very sensitive land link to the Northeast, which
Yeah.
is through the Siliguri corridor,
Mm.
a 23-kilometer stretch of land,
Correct.
which in a major conflict with China would be very hard to defend.
Mm.
I think, from a military standpoint, because the
Mm.
Chinese presence in Doklam,
Mm.
which is the tri-junction of Bhutan
Yeah.
and India,
Mm.
gives them almost, breathing presence over the Siliguri corridor.
Mm.
So that area, anti-India forces in Bangladesh now probably are operating in that area,
Yeah.
in Tripura, in
Mm.
Meghalaya, and so on. So
Mm.
it's a very complicated part of India,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
I don't blame the government for feeling that insurgency will be very difficult to resolve here.
Mm.
What we can do is we can pump in huge development money, create jobs, build infrastructure, improve the quality of life of the people here, which they have been doing, I think, in a major way since 2014.
Yeah.
Instead of neglecting the area, instead of
Mm.
saying that, we will neglect it and we will just manage you through massive military presence.
Mm.
I think my interpretation is the last 10, 11 years, they have moved away a little bit from that. For example, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act
Yeah.
was removed in certain areas
Yeah.
from certain districts.
Mm.
And that was, that was a big move.
Mm.
But it will take time. It's not something that's
Absolutely.
going to happen very quickly.
Absolutely. I'm running out of time, but I'm going to quickly ask you to take one more challenge that you have
Okay.
outlined, which is the Naxalism and Maoist insurgency. There's a lot of efforts being made, and the Home Minister has also made a comment that it will get wiped out by 2026. What explains the Maoist insurgency despite decades of state counterinsurgency operations? And how do you view the Maoist parallel states managing to retain legitimacy?
Look, the Maoist problem has a very difficult and very historical connection with,
Mm.
Peasant revolts in India.
Mm.
If you go back and study peasant movements, peasant revolts in India, there's a strong connection with that.
Mm.
There's a strong connection also with tribal politics, because the areas that the Maoists dominated were mostly the forested areas of central India, eastern India.
Mm.
People are mostly tribals. So there's serious, questions around development, lack of development, and then later on, when you had development, who did the development benefit, those
Mm.
kind of questions.
Yeah.
Very, very strong connection with accessibility of forests, because, people who are forest dwellers, did they have, uninterrupted access to forests? And because the forest provided livelihood.
Mm.
So if the state comes in and says, the forest has suddenly become no-go because a
Mm.
mining company has come in, then, this is tied to land, this is tied to livelihoods, this is tied to, the tribal well-being, the tribal way of life,
Mm.
etc.
Mm.
So it's a complicated picture. But it is also connected to leftist politics in India.
Yeah.
Because, when the Communist Party of India started breaking up on the question of whether they are going to give up the revolutionary path to power. So this was fundamentally the question, right? So the initial split was between the CPI and the CPIM.
Mm.
CPI accepted that in a democratic India, elections might be the way to come to power.
Right.
So if you want to implement your policies, you need power, but you can't come to power through the point of a gun, through
Correct.
revolution. You have to come to power by fighting elections.
Correct.
So on this question, there was the initial split between CPI, CPIM.
Yeah.
And then when the CPIM later on also agreed that we have to fight elections, then another split happened. The CPIML was created,
Correct.
which still held on to this notion of of revolution in India, communist revolution. And they were not looking at Russia, they were not looking at Europe, they were looking more towards China, what happened in China, and later on towards Vietnam.
Yeah.
So Mao and Ho Chi Minh to them became their iconic leaders in a sense. And it started with extreme exploitation of workers, particularly plantation workers. So the Naxalbari Andolan in the late 60s, early 70s in Bengal.
Yeah.
Started with the tea plantation and the abject condition of the workers in those plantations. So from that, it has snowballed into this, tribal type of movement in central India and so on. This has obviously been fanned, I would say, by well-meaning but perhaps misguided intellectual elements. People who are well-educated have often led the movement intellectually. But what is their answer to the problems of these people, poor farmers, tribals, etc.? The answer is we have to overthrow what they call the bourgeois state.
Correct.
Bourgeois state, dominated by the upper groups and so on. And we have to completely throw it out and create some kind of a people's democracy. But then if you look at the empirical evidence around the world, did people's democracy also work anymore?
Yeah.
So that's the question, right? But a lot of the left political parties wanted this to go on because this was a way of also, promoting their electoral agendas and so on. And other parties took advantage of it. So I can tell you in West Bengal, certain political parties fanned the Maoist problem in Bengal because it brought in central funds, which then, of course, some of it would be spent on trying to fight the Maoists, but most of it would be siphoned off for other purposes.
Sticky fingers, absolutely.
So it became almost like a vicious cycle, where you have an insurgency and everybody benefits from the insurgency in electoral terms, in financial terms, and so on. Some good work the CPM had done in the very early 70s when they had power in terms of Operation Borga, the land redistribution, land to the tiller and so on and so forth. And I've seen some of that in my tours to rural Bengal. In Bengali, we used to we have the phrase called Bhag Chashi. Means, the guy who tills the land gets a part of the produce.
Correct.
So you may be the owner of the land, but you don't actually go and till it. So you employ somebody to till it. So you then have a share. So sharecropper, in English.
Yep.
And I see that in many villages in Bengal even today. But has it solved their problem? Has it solved the problem of landlessness? Has it solved the problem of tribal villagers? I can tell you this story. I mean, my mama bari, in the sense that my mother's family, hails from Purulia, which is right on the border with, this jungle mahal and the Maoist problem. So in Purulia, my memory is that I used to go in the 70s as a young schoolboy, and I used to see these tribal villages, and the children all would have these big protruding bellies, which is from malnutrition, right?
Correct.
And in our village area, the main tribe is known as the Bauri tribe. So these people would have these protruding bellies and so on and so forth, and very abject, poor conditions in the villages. They used to live in the outskirts of the villages because, there was this also caste politics involved. The main village was mostly upper caste. But when I went there last year, I did not see a massive improvement in the condition of the Pauris, at least, the village that I went to. And many of the same things that I had seen in the 70s. But there was one notable difference. Many of the leaders of these groups were now driving around in Scorpio SUVs.
And had fat bellies.
Yes, and they had gold chains around their neck, and they had massive houses built in the local town in Purulia city, Purulia town, and so on. So what it tells you is that the political parties have done a fantastic job in co-opting the leadership. So this is one way of silencing the people, right? So you co-opt the leaders, make them rich. They are corrupt like anything.
Absolutely.
And what happens to the population? You're still living in that kind of an environment that you lived in 40 years ago. So I have a feeling that while the central government is right that we can't continue this, we have to go after the leadership, the cadres, a classic decapitation strategy. That if you take out the top leaders, if you kill the hardcore cadre strength within the Maoists, then the rest will either surrender or they will just simply disappear and come back to civilian life. So we can have that. So we can have that from law and order point of view. But I think the center also probably needs to have an open mind about the conditions of these people. That India's 75 years of development history and the way the politics is done at the state level. Absolutely. I don't think it is helping these people, honestly.
Correct. I agree. But that said, it's a very, very different discussion on politics, politicians, and which system of governance has really worked anywhere in the world. And I've often said this, that, multiple systems have been tried in the world. And the fact that after hundreds of years of the world and 75 years of India, we still talk about roti kapda makan. And that itself, it says, is something which appeals to the very, very poor, is a real story of how our country has been governed over the so many years.
I agree. And I think it's a Ashutosh, if you can give me 2 minutes,
Sure.
A big point that I would like to make is that, we created deliberately a federal polity.
Correct.
Because our framers thought that India can't be governed through a highly centralized government. It will probably create, feelings of injustice, frustration in the peripheries, in the surrounding parts of the country. So we need to devolve power. So federalism, and then the Panchayati Raj system. You have a central government, you have federal governments, but then you have local governments, at the level of the village and block and so on. So multi-tiered government, right? But my sense is that needs to be looked at very carefully now, because what has happened is also mushrooming of regional parties, which are, if I can use the word, very undemocratic in the way they operate.
Correct.
Not to mention, the rampant corruption, the misuse of power, and all the rest of it. And to touch them, and most of these parties are also hereditary parties.
Yeah.
They are dynastic parties, right?
Correct.
They're not, if you ask, what is the ideology of these parties, you'll be scratching your head forever.
Yeah.
You wouldn't. So the only ideology is opportunism. Wherever I get an opportunity to make money, I make money.
Absolutely.
So rampant corruption, rampant misuse of power, all these things are happening, and by local parties. But every time you try to touch them, you say, well, what you're doing is not good for the country, and I need to come and stop it, or we should stop that. They would say, oh, you're violating the spirit of cooperative federalism. So cooperative federalism, I think, is now being misinterpreted to mean almost personalized jungle raj in some states.
Absolutely.
And you can probably find states which are fairly well governed with the right intention.
Yeah.
And you can also find states, and I won't name them because it would create controversy.
Yes.
But there are also states where you can find, practically now jungle raj going on.
Correct.
People are, no security, nothing. Their future is absolutely bleak.
Absolutely.
And you know what I'm hinting at.
Absolutely.
So there are many
states, something like that, and I agree with you completely. But
and this is problematic in the sense that we started our conversation by saying India needs to stay intact, right?
Yeah.
So if you take this federalism idea to its logical conclusion, then there might be some chief ministers in some states
Yeah.
who may actually start believing that they are actually prime ministers
I
of
know.
a separate country.
I know. But I always say that, at the end of the day, it is this large country where better sense prevails because of just the fact that so many of us have believed in just the fact that we are Indians, we are part of this beautiful country, and there will be politicians who will continuously try to break it. People have not been able to do it over thousands of years, and I don't think we will reach such a stage. I sincerely hope we don't reach such a stage. But I just want to say, Rajat, I could just keep talking to you for another hour because you are such an amazing amount of knowledge about India with so much amount of research. We've been speaking for
Thank
about
you.
an hour, but I do want to be able to schedule another conversation or with you on India because my viewers and listeners would love to get your perspectives. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.